G'day legends. Alright, in this video we're going to be talking about Dana White's comments on Islam Makhachev versus Jon Jones on the pound for pound list in the UFC. And I got a couple of theories as to why Dana White is acting this way. We're going to get into it in this video. Alright, so wrapping up after UFC 302, going into this week, there are so many big storylines going on in MMA right now. There's obviously the Conor McGregor having the press conference in Dublin, Ireland, cancelled. And we are seeing news online that it was because of Conor McGregor got cancelled. So there's that story that's going to unfold today as well. Then there's Alexander Volkanovski calling out Dustin Poirier. Then there's Sean Strickland saying that he's going to sit out until he gets his title shot. There's so many little threads that have been pulled after a fairly boring UFC 302. But to me, the one that I wanted to talk about the most, because this one, everything else is sort of speculation, but this one did actually happen. Dana White just spouting absolute lies again about how Jon Jones is the pound for pound #1 fighter in the UFC at the moment. And if you want to know what I mean by him spouting absolute lies again, this is coming from the guy who says that Power Slap is bigger than all other sports combined on social media. He says that the Power Slap game, when it dropped on Android, broke all of the records of any Android game ever, right? He said to us that the idea of Mark Zuckerberg getting a private event at the Apex was absolute bullshit. And Mark Zuckerberg did have a private event at the UFC Apex. So when Dana White talks, you know, not to just take it with a pinch of salt, but a whole bloody slab of salt, all right? There needs to be more salt than when Jamal Hill talks, yeah? There needs to be more salt than whenever Aljamain Sterling is talking about Sean O'Malley, right? You need to have more salt than when MMA Joey mentions Sean Strickland. Dana White started absolutely praising, I'm not using that other word that you guys on the internet like to use, I hate that other word, but he started absolutely praising Jon Jones as the current #1 pound for pound fighter in the UFC, talking about his legacy, talking about how many fights he's done, how this unbeaten streak he's been on has gone for years and years, how he beat the absolute best heavyweight in the world. I didn't know Cyril Gane was the absolute best heavyweight in the world. How Jon Jones might be one of the most dangerous men, not just in the UFC, not just in MMA, but in all of combat sports in the entire world, across all of the skill sets, across all of the weight classes, across all of our sports. Dana White went absolute spit shine mode on Jon Jones for so reason, and I cannot understand why. This is so wild to me. Dana White is giving so much praise to Jon Jones when Jon Jones has caused so many headaches for the UFC. So many. In the past, he has failed multiple drug tests. He has had entire events move location because he hasn't been able to get his shit together. They pulled out of UFC main events, which Dana White hates UFC main events getting cancelled. His theory is the show must always go on. It's so weird, right? It was very publicly, he's been very publicly difficult to negotiate with when it comes to getting a UFC contract signed for his next stuff. All of this is public knowledge for people who have a deep understanding of MMA history, for people who have followed the sport for a long time. That's why it is so weird to see him praise Jon Jones so much. And people have been saying, one of the things that I've talked about is that he praises Jon Jones so much to keep Jones's name above Francis Ngannou's name. But with what the audience just last saw of Francis, I don't think he needs to go this hard on it, right? The casual audience just saw Francis Ngannou knocked out by Anthony Joshua. That will always play in their minds. Anytime Francis Ngannou says anything about Jon Jones, you'll just have Jon Jones fans dropping that gif into the comments section. He doesn't need to go this far above and beyond with the absolute spit shine that he's giving Jones to keep Jones higher in people's minds than Francis, okay? I'm gonna give you 3 theories as to why Dana White is doing this. Number 1, Jon Jones has been in the UFC for a very, very long time. And when you look at everything that's happened with the UFC's biggest business partner now, Vince McMahon over at the WWE, you know that there is some shady shit that has gone on behind the door of these big ass companies. And nobody was immune to the Me Too movement and the sort of rhetoric that continues because of that movement today. There have always been rumors of Ronda Rousey and Dana White and what Ronda Rousey had to do to get herself into the UFC and other women into the UFC as well. Could Jon Jones know something about what was happening in the UFC during that era? His management team was working closely with the UFC to get his new contract negotiations going and sorted out during that era. Even Dana White's biggest partners from that era, the Lorenzo brothers, they've moved on from the UFC. The UFC has gone and sold itself to Endeavor and had a complete rework of its business practices. Since then, Endeavor has gone and partnered and become TKO, a whole new group. Back then, UFC was on Spike TV, then it went to Fox, now it's on ESPN. The UFC is a very, very different company to what it was back in the day when Ronda Rousey was getting signed. And Jon Jones is one of those few legacy era guys that is still in the modern UFC. Him and pretty much Joe Rogan, that's about it these days. Could Jon Jones have any evidence of Dana White's sexual allegations with some of his employees, maybe even Ronda Rousey, back in those mid-level days of the UFC, right? The second one is, it could all be to do with some text messages and emails. There were text messages and emails that came out during the recent UFC lawsuit that got settled. And one of the biggest text scandals that we saw go all over MMA Twitter was Dana White talking to his business partners about Jon Jones and how badly Dana was speaking of one of his biggest fighters behind closed doors. Now, a lot of text messages came up in court, but not all of them came into the public sphere. Not all of them made them onto the news of Twitter. Could it be that there are some other text threads that Jon Jones got through his lawyers that got revealed to the team that Jon Jones might have access to that would make Dana White look very, very bad? I don't know. It's a hell of a lot of spit shining for Dana White to do for just a couple of text messages. And the last theory, the one that I sort of believe the most. Jon Jones has got a horrible, horrible past when it comes to his drug testing. He has failed multiple drug tests. They have a bit of a deal with their athletes where they will hide the suspensions or not make their drug test fails public and just sort of sideline them for 1 or 2 years. It's very weird that we saw Jon Jones say that he was going to move up to heavyweight and then sit out for nearly 3 years and come back with not the most chiseled body you've ever seen, right? He might have been hiding a 24-month or he might have been hiding a 12-month or a 24-month suspension, and this isn't the only time there is something like that has gone on, right? Khamzat Chimaev just sat out for a year, and when he came back, he became a cardioless shadow of his former self. Yeah, you've got people who sit out for an entire year with. I mean, look at Yuri Prohaska. Set out for so long with a shoulder injury. He took almost twice as long as he needed to get his shoulder injury healed up. There have just been a lot of little examples of weird things happening with fighters taking a lot of time off and then coming back not looking exactly how they were before. Is it ring rust, or is it some fighters sitting out a suspension quietly? And has Jon Jones sat out more suspensions than we think he has? And now that Dana White has gone on for so long selling us this narrative of how much he wants a clean sport, as well as selling us this narrative of how Jon Jones is the GOAT, has Jon Jones been able to sit down and go, Dana, I'm happy tanking my career. I'm a bit of a psycho. Do you want me to come out with these failed drug tests? Because I don't really care. And that's sort of put Dana White in a bit of a corner where he has to be so nice to Jon Jones or make it look like the UFC has been covering for athletes that have been cheating. To me, that is sort of the most believable scenario of what has gone on here. So they are the theories as to why Dana White is saying so heavily that Jon Jones is the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. And just before we wrap this video up, Jon Jones is not the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. He can go on the GOAT list. He has a great legacy. But pound-for-pound means who has the best skill set in the UFC at the moment. And that is not Jon Jones, okay? His striking sucks. He got beaten in the striking by Dominic Reyes. That has aged terribly for Jon Jones. He barely beat a one-legged Thiago Santos on one knee. That has aged terribly for Jon Jones. He went to a decision with Anthony Smith. His striking sucks. Jon Jones's striking is not good, okay? Islam Makhachev just beat one of the best boxers in the UFC, a lot of it with the striking. He just outstruck Alexander Volkanovski twice. In the first one, Alexander Volkanovski just beat the living piss out of Max Holloway, made Max Holloway look like he doesn't even deserve to be in a UFC cage, okay? These two fighters are not the fucking same. There's a very clear difference between Jon Jones and Islam Makhachev. One of them is clearly the better striking. Just because John Jones out-wrestled Cyril Gane for 30 seconds doesn't make him the most elite wrestler in the UFC. Cyril Gane wouldn't even know what a fucking wrestling room's wrestling mat even looks like, yeah? And Islam Makhachev, I mean, Alexander Volkanovski's primary, like his base before he came over to UFC was rugby and wrestling. Dustin Poirier has known for 5 years he's going to need to fight a Dagestani wrestler again. Has been training every single day, probably for like 4 or 5 hours a day, just in fucking wrestling with Gamrot. And Makhachev still gave it to him. And just because John Jones can look at Cyril Gane, who's a fucking Muay Thai striker, wouldn't even know where a wrestling room is in France, you're going to say that John Jones is a better wrestler? It's fucking crazy, man. It's so annoying. It's so annoying. So, there has to be a reason for Dana White to be so clearly lying about John Jones being the pound-for-pound fighter in the world. With Power Slap and why he's so clearly lying, it's very obvious. It's his company. It's his investment. He's trying to get his return on investment. That makes total sense. Why he is spit-shining John Jones so much, no idea, but I'm sure we will find out in the fullness of time. They are 3 theories. Let me know what you think about them down there in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, trying to get this channel to 1,000 subs. So if you could hit that sub button, that would be awesome. And UFC fights this weekend. Going to be live streaming every single fight on the main card, not every single fight of the prelims. Starting a bit early for me. It's a bit loud in the house when I start live streaming that early in the morning. So going to be live streaming every single fight from the main card. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, leave a comment, and I'll see you all in the next one.